Well, and as Georgia mentioned, the book that Nikki Jones and I just finished, we titled, wait, I gotta get my jet lag survival gear, caffeine. Later we do wine, but right now we do caffeine. Okay, so first a big mahalo and thank you to Georgia Lieb and Billy Weiss and your chair, who just so graciously introduced this event. About a week ago, I realized what in the world possessed me to say I could come and talk about gangs in Los Angeles. So I just have to say, it was like an aha moment. It was like, Georgia's such a great person that she says, I really want you to help me. I want you to come talk about girls. And I thought, yeah, I can talk about that. And she said, girls' gangs. I said, yeah, right, sure. Okay, so here's where we start. We don't start with girls and gangs. We start with our young women. These are two of my faves. And what is interesting about these young women is that both of them are celebrities, of course. They're famous for being famous. But what else is interesting to them, since we're in the School of Social Work, our social welfare, is that both have been criminalized, right? Both have been involved in the criminal justice system. Now this strikes me as peculiar. If you think about celebrities of the past, I'm thinking specifically about Marilyn Monroe, who was in the foster care system, who did have documented histories of problems with drugs. The difference was, how many times was she busted? 0. Okay, I hope you're already seeing a bit of a story here. A lot of what I do is really less about girls' behavior, although we'll get into that, and more about media framing about girls, and particularly certain kinds of girls. But let's back up in time here a little bit, and I want to talk about some of the disappointments I've had coming out of sort of the turn of the century. I really expected after Carol Gilligan's work was published, and the AUW material started showing up about the systems that were failing girls, particularly educational systems, that my phone was not going to ring. I'm a criminologist, as you mentioned. I do stuff on girls and delinquency, but instead my phone started ringing off the hook. And the first, there were many, I mean, my favorite was the Ricky Lake show that wanted to talk to me about girls who were thugs. And I realized, okay, I guess I got a new line of work here. And really the beat has gone on and on in terms of my career. We're going to be talking, and I want you to look at some of these images, because the first girls that we saw that were really being coded as violent are the images you see here. And this was during the moral panic about gangs, and particularly girls and gangs. Now, nothing is accidental in media framing. So tell me what we think about when we hear the phrase "girls will be girls." Do we think about that image? Or that image? Nothing is accidental. This is probably the very first information America ever got about young women of color. And what are they seeing? Girls will be girls. They're seeing these menacing images of young women of color. Their very violence is positioned against stereotypical notions of white femininity. That's the girls will be girls. And then we see the menacing image, and then we say, some girls carry guns, others hide razor blades in their mouths. So one of the themes in the work that I do is talking about the demonization of young women of color. And that's going to have real consequences, so remember that we've talked about this. Okay, so time marches on, we get out of the moral panic on gangs, and we get into, it doesn't ever get any better. This is Royal Ford. I actually talked to this guy, he writes for the Boston Globe, and I got him off the gun thing. I just said, well, factually, that's incorrect. They may be mules, they may carry guns, but they don't really actually use guns very often. So I gave him the information that girls, if they carry anything, carry knives. So we got the knife thing featured. This is victory, okay? Now what's interesting though about this is that this marks a shift in the discourse, because Columbine had happened. Now let's back up a little bit here. Will somebody please tell me the ethnicity of the Columbine killers? White. And gender?
Male.
Did we have a conversation nationally about hyper-violent white male youth in America? No? Okay, interesting. If those two boys had been African American or Latino, would we have had a conversation about race and kids who were, hyper-violent? No, instead when we start talking, and do we talk about gun control? Hello? No, we don't do that either. What do we talk about? We do this. Kids killing kids. So what happens is, with each of these media frames, and when we get into the all kids are bad, all kids are violent discourse, we sweep up the girls again. So now it's bad girls, as part of the Columbine thing. Well, now we're finally going to get to the white girls. I could talk for days, so I'm sorry. I apologize in advance. I have a whole Mean Girl riff. If you want me to talk more about the Mean Girls later, we can do the Mean Girls. Okay, but I want to say a couple of things here. Is this girl a perpetrator or a victim? She's a victim. When victims are portrayed in the media, they're almost always portrayed as white. This is another challenge that you have in the field that you're in, because the kids you're going to be working with are not going to look like this. And judges and everybody else know about victim. They know about violence against women. They imagine a white face. So one of our challenges is to disrupt those kinds of challenges. But we did get to the white girls gone crazy. I don't know what Newsweek would do if they didn't have these girl, videos to be talking about. And of course, if we had more time, we could do the cheerleader thing in Florida, but we'll just stay with this one. So now we have savagery in the suburbs. Do we really have savagery in the suburbs? Well, if you listen to some of my colleagues like Jim Garbarino, who actually did a fairly good book on Columbine, so I'm sorry that he did this book. What's the title of this one? See Jane Hit? She's kind of a scary little white girl, isn't she? I just am fascinated. These books are really bad. I'm sorry, they're bad science. But it's, again, very important to know that they're out there, because in the case of this crowd over here, they're in Harvard. They're in a very elite public health institution. Very bad book. Okay, sorry, it is. If it's bad, it's bad. I call them like I see them. Okay, here's another common media frame. This was now we're into this, this millennium. We're talking about data that were collected from all school-aged youth, and you see the headline, 1 in 4 girls involved in violence, but here comes an even more important media frame. Can someone read this for me? Go ahead.
Violence rates are highest for blacks, 38%, and lowest for Asians, 17.3%.
Okay.
Hispanic, 29.
Okay, that's good. You got it already. So who are we going to blame? Got it, everybody? Yep. Black people. And if you got a little extra anger and pissed offness, you can go to those Latinos. Because we got it right here in the data. Okay, I'm going to talk about these data because with every data story, there's a story and then there's another story. So let's go and understand again that when we talk about the violence that we're going to criminalize, not hospitalize, we're mostly going to be talking about young women of color. So that's how my research agenda apparently gets set. Is I wake up in the morning and I'm listening to NPR or something like that, and I hear some very strange thing and I have to go, or I see something in the media and I go, okay, here we go. I'm going to have to find out about this. So I have been doing a fair amount of thinking about trends in girls' violence. The first story here is an important story for those of you going into the system. When I started, as George mentioned, a long, long time ago when the dinosaurs were roaming the earth, really studying girls in delinquency was kind of a boutique topic. That's what one of my deans said about my work, in a very dismissive way. Don't ever let people in authority discourage you about the work you're going to do. If you have a passion for it, you should do it and not listen to anybody's advice. Because my career is an essay in why you should never listen to what smart older people tell you. I learned to be very skillful at smiling at them, being very genial. I also worked in prisons a lot, so people tell you incredibly stupid things, and you just learn this skill of just, oh my God, I can't believe I just heard that. And then you just keep going, and you get in and you gather your data. So it's important for us to look at these official data because girls were 1 in 5 arrests a couple of decades ago. They're now about 1/3 of all juvenile arrests. So the system that was designed for, the out-of-control boy is now seeing a huge number of young women. And so That's a big story in and of itself, and it's a big challenge for that system. So we will be talking about what the systems are doing in response. But that's a huge shift. Then we get to some really peculiar data. For years, I could even count on the aggravated assault to be going in two directions, but now we've actually seen a decrease in both boys and girls arrests for aggravated assault. But look at this one. What's going on here? Got an increase in girls arrests and a decrease, a rather substantial one, in boys arrests. Same thing with disorderly conduct. Now these are kind of garbage pail offenses. Anybody who's ever worked with police will tell you that, we really don't even know what it means when a kid's busted for assault. It's not in the index crime category for a reason, because so many jurisdictions use it in such a loose fashion. But it definitely, and here I'll give you another shot of just the assault data. Look at that. I mean, the arrests of girls for simple assault has been flying up in the last couple of decades, during this time when we've been talking a lot about kids and violence. Wow, sounds like that Brittany Paris thing is actually really true, right? Okay, well, I'm from Missouri when it comes to statistics. And one of the things, going back to these earlier stats, one of the things I want to talk to you about is the crime drop that Al Bloomstein and others talk about. It was really a boy crime drop. The dynamics that were driving crime, particularly in the 90s, that drove boys' arrests up, changed. Now, one of the things it's always very mysterious to figure out what arrest data mean. But in retrospect, we can pretty much see that the crime drop was a male crime drop, not a female crime drop. So some of this, we're really going to be looking at gendered patterns. Okay, we're going now. So I get all the calls. All these reporters, Parade Magazine, Salon.com, what's going on? Oh my God! They've already seen all the frames. They know what's going on. They just want me to ratify their stereotypes. And I say to them, look, if all these girls were going so wild, let's take that crime of murder. Wouldn't there be some dead bodies around eventually? Girls are going wild. They're tearing down the streets. I was walking across the campus in total fear of my life that, girl gangs are going to take me out, on my way down to Trader Joe's. Okay, yes, I did find Trader Joe's, trust me. Okay, so, what do we see? We see nothing. If anything, we see a decline. Let me give you the numbers. Arrests of girls for murder fell 36% between 2005 and 2009. So if all boats are rising on the river, if girls are getting hyper-violent, why in the world is murder not going anywhere? First weird bit of data. Okay, so here's what I think, in a nutshell, because I got to get to girls and gangs. We got three things going on. We have, here's some graduate student explanations for this, but here, I'll just give you the next slide. Zero tolerance in schools. We have taken the principal's ability to simply say, if I take $2 off of Georgia, I go to her and I say, give me $2. What if I just, and she gives it to me because she's a little afraid of me. It's like, give me that food. Okay. What if I take money from her? What have I just done? What's the crime that just happened? Robbery. Robbery. Theft is a good guess, but it's only partially correct. Because robbery involves, I'm looking at a use of force and I'm threatening her. It's a direct confrontation. I may have a weapon. Who knows? This little clicker. Hey, listen, girls have been busted for Midol. So, you may think, or a plastic fork, or spork, have got kids busted. So, you don't have to look far to make up, or to begin to understand. The other thing that's going on is we had no idea when we pushed for mandatory arrests of perpetrators of domestic violence that we would see such a huge increase, and these are California data. So notice that a couple of years ago, 1987, a little before I got fellowed, it was always so interesting to be a fellow of the American Union. Anyway, it's wonderful to be a feminist, all these things abuse you. Okay, 1987, women were 5% of domestic violence arrests in California. In 2000, we were 18%. So what's going on here? Really short story here. The batterers have gotten really smart, and it's a race to the phone. Who can get to the phone first and say, as one of my friends Anyway, long story short, a Navy SEAL was calling on his wife. Right. He's in fear for his life from his wife. This is what's happening in the area of domestic violence. And there's a very good study, if you want to see more data. When women are actually suspected of this, they are far more likely than their male counterparts to be arrested. And that is particularly true if daughters are accused of this. Kids in general in domestic, and a lot of domestic violence involves kids, because they're the ones pissed off at their parents. And particularly daughters, because they're the ones trying to shove past mom to see that boy that mom doesn't like and doesn't approve of, or stepdad doesn't like or doesn't approve of. And if I shove past someone on the way out the door, what have I committed? Or what if she slaps me and I slap her back? Assault. Will mom get arrested? No. Arresting an adult is complicated. Arresting a juvenile is simple. You have no civil rights if you're under the age of 18. You don't have the right to a trial by jury. You don't have the right to bail. It's just, if there's an adult there may be a little other minor kids. It's complicated to arrest an adult. It's simple to arrest a kid. So the data from Eve Bazawa and her colleagues, and there's some in our book too, really point to the disadvantage that youth have, particularly girls have, in these kind of domestic violence settings. Okay, finally, I'm sorry about a chart. Just pretend you're, going to get your driver's license or something. Somebody tell me what, now this is from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. It's one of these studies that's done every couple of years by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. These are self-report studies that go out to a random sample of kids across America. What do the numbers show in terms of girls and physical assault? Look across this first row here. Up or down? Down. Down. How about for boys? Also down, but less dramatically. Virtually all the measures we have that are self-report data show an exact reversal of the data presented in the arrests. This is, and people have gone through this, my colleagues and I, it's pretty much now settled science that girls are not getting more violent. Instead, again, what's happening is that anytime there's an arrest, there are two people present. There's the person who's supposedly committing the behavior, causing the arrest, and then who else is in this frame? A victim. Okay, that's good. But then who else? A police officer or a teacher or somebody has to say, this is serious, I'm going to arrest you. Don't forget the changes in that person's behavior. They're not passive, they're actors in this drama. And again, they've been bombarded with media images that suggest that girls are getting more violent. So when they have a very chaotic situation, what we're now suggesting is that they're much more likely to arrest girls than a couple of decades ago. And we actually have another study, which I can, you don't ever get, connected with me, I'll keep bombarding you with papers. We have a very good study that absolutely nails this. It appeared in Justice Quarterly within the last couple of months. So it's not even just sort of, it's a much tighter study even than the argument I'm making today, but this one's easier to understand. Why was I so suspicious? Well, I'd been through one of these fake crime waves before. In the 70s, we had Ed Davis. Anyone remember old Chief Ed Davis, LAPD? Real jerk. I'm sorry. This is what gets me in trouble. He blamed the women's lib movement for the increase in crime that happened in the 70s that actually didn't happen, but never mind. But in those years, mostly we were concerned about young women who were drug-using, hippie, anti-war folks. Yeah?
I heard also in a class that I took that women, or that young girls, teenagers, are a lot more likely to be arrested for status offenses than their male counterparts are. And so that's part of the factor that goes into the higher arrest rates, because as a society we think that our little girls need to be innocent and pure and stay home at night, and if they break that norm, then that's terrible, but it's not so terrible for our boys.
When I started my career, virtually all of the arrests of girls were running away from home. What we think is going on is just relabeling that behavior, only now as you try to run out the door, basically to run away, you may be arrested for runaway, and girls still are a majority of those arrested. The two offenses where girls predominate or women predominate among all the UCR crime categories are runaway, and the other one is prostitution. So yes, that's a time-honored pattern, and you're right to also point to that, because in fact, a lot of these girls are just relabeled status offenders. But arrests for runaway have actually been decreasing because we're now arresting girls for assault. And that is actually worse for them. It's better for them if they're actually arrested for a status offense, because there are fewer rules. I mean, there are some constraints about where I can put you if you're arrested, if you just run past and we call you a runaway, versus if I call you if you're guilty of a violent or person offense. It's much easier. In fact, in some states, I can now count on mandatory detention for you if you're arrested for domestic violence. That happens in Florida. So let me just get to I did have one success in California. This was the San Francisco Weekly. They called me with the standard, they want to do the La Vida Loca, crazy Hispanic girl gang member. And I said, would you do a more nuanced story about a young woman growing up in a barrio who is not in a gang, but who has to negotiate the gang space every day? And she did, and they did. And then they dressed I don't know if you can see, but they dressed the Barbie dolls in gang attire. And they were poking fun at the media frenzy. So it's really, I was pleased that reporter got it. But my victories are few and far between. But okay, what about actual girls in gangs? What do we know? And now I'm going to get a lot more humble and hope to listen and learn from you. I will tell you what the literature says, what I think some of the best research is about, oh gosh, how many years ago was it? Yeah, I heard a presentation by a guy by the name of John Quicker, who I think is from the LA area. And this was the very first paper I'd ever heard about girls in gangs. And he talked a lot about the girls that he was interviewing here who were in gangs. And he figured out that actually they were the same age as girls in Girl Scouts. And I've never forgotten his insight, that girls in gangs were the age at which they were joining gangs was sort of similar to the girls joining Girl Scouts, that the gang was providing a lot of the same structure and meaning to the girls. And what I loved about Quicker, and so a decade later, I started collecting, and I'm a collector. I was like Googling on Yelp last night, thrift shops in around here. It's like, what's here? What stuff you got that I can take back home? But I collected a whole bunch of articles on girls in gangs because nobody ever talked about this as far as I could tell. And then finally ran into a guy named John Hagedorn who did a book on boy gangs in Milwaukee. And I remember coming up to him after one of these presentations. Actually, I may have confronted him in the audience. And I said, did you ever talk to the girls? And it's like, no, people don't, but at least John was like, oh wow, good idea. Why didn't I think of that? So he then did, and has written some great work with Joan Moore. And then he and I edited a book called Female Gangs in America that sold about 3 copies as far as I can tell. And I put John Quicker's piece in there. It had never been published. And I put in a whole bunch of other things that I thought were very good. One of the things that's interesting about, and these are some pretty good data from this, Georgia and I are on this NIJ gang study group, I guess we are called. And anyway, in there, we learned that actually girls are a pretty substantial, if you get past, as Joan Moore so correctly identified it, the gendered habits of researchers who, from Frederick Thrasher on, when they thought about gang, they saw boys. And there were like a lot of girls in the frame, but it's like, well, where are the boys? Where are the boys? We gotta talk some gang members, It's like, and they ignored the girls. They walked right past them, never asked them what they were doing there. Turns out, between a quarter and a third to maybe even a half of kids, depending upon the age that you look at, of the kids in gangs are actually girls. Now, girls age out quicker than boys. But again, what it means is if you're doing prevention, and you're doing gang prevention, and you're not addressing girls and their problems, you're missing a whole lot of what's going on. Maybe a third to a quarter of the kids. We picked that up when we were studying gangs in Hawaii, which I had to get into the gang game. And I really expected, because even I was seeing all these hyped images of these girls in gangs, and so I thought, boy, when we get into this gang stuff, it's really going to be scary. These girls are way different from my status offenders that I was used to, or my youth, the kids on the streets. They were the same kids. They were the same kids. They had the same histories. So why do girls join gangs? Well, for the same reason as boys in some instances. And what are those reasons? This is stuff you've already heard from other speakers. Fun, protection, affirmation. Boys, though, are more likely to join gangs for money than girls, and to report that. About half of boys say they're in it for the money. Girls, not so much. What are girls doing? Well, girls are more interested in and drawn to the effective aspects of the gang. And this has to do with their own problems at home. They don't have a good home life. Their problems with their mothers are likely very troubled. Some of this, if you're talking about immigration as a theme, there's very gendered expectations that parents have of daughters and sons. And like the runaway story we heard earlier, parents are really arguing with their girls about what they're doing, who they're going out with, what's going on. This can sometimes become abusive. So girls are really drawn to the gang for those more emotional reasons. Now, this is a bit stereotypical. Boys are going for money, girls are going for a place to belong, a surrogate family. But the reason we have stereotypes is that they're important and they point to certain gender differences. But if you look at, does it work for the girls? If you compare girl and non-girl gang kids, gang member girls and non-gang member girls from the same neighborhoods, what you discover is that the girls who are drawn to the gangs in those neighborhoods have more neighborhood disorder, more family disadvantage, more peer fighting, less parental attachment, and more concerns about school safety. So they have lower self-esteem. When boys join gangs, they get more self-esteem. When girls join gangs, they get less self-esteem. So why is that? Well, maybe because there are problems when you join gangs for girls. Some of them are like the boy problems. You may have heard that gangs are involved in criminal behavior. Okay, this is not a good thing for kids to be around. Even if they've been drawn to the group for reasons of looking for looking for protection, looking for a sense of belonging, there's stuff going on there that's dangerous. And so when you compare gang and non-gang girls from, again, the same neighborhoods, you see girls who are involved in gangs far more likely to carry weapons, 79% compared to 30%. Far more likely to report that they've been in a gang fight, 79% to 30%. Far more likely to report that they've attacked somebody, and far more likely to report that they've not only used drugs, but they sell drugs. Let me give you those data. 56% of girls involved in gangs reported having sold crack cocaine, compared to 7% of their counterparts from the same neighborhoods who are not involved in gangs. So gangs are criminogenic when girls hang around with those groups and in mixed-sex gangs, most of the gangs that have girls in them are not single-sex girl gangs. It's not like the ladies' auxiliary patterns that we used to see in earlier decades. They're in these mixed-sex environments, and that, by the way, produces a whole other set of problems, because they got boys around, okay? And this is not good news for them. Well, the first thing we know from Alice Cepeda's research and from others, certainly we saw it in our data, is that core Madonna stuff is still there. The good girl, bad girl. I'm doing some other work with Vera Lopez, looking at how young women who are Latino, and how young Latinas feel about the stereotypes of them when they're in these kinds of environments. But the reality is those stereotypes are also held by the boys in their environments and in their gangs. And in Cepeda's where we hear about hood rats versus good girls. Now these are boys who basically say, we have our good girlfriends and we have the girls that are in the gang that we sexually prey on. They have different kinds of parties based on, is it a family party, in which case I bring my good girlfriend, or is it a party where the girls are really going to be at risk? And, I don't want to say that gangs are, no, I do. I want to say that gangs are dangerous environments for girls. Sexual assault is a risk. But then we also have to remind ourselves, as we talk about these terribly risky environments for girls, that UCLA probably has a lot of these same risk factors in your fraternities, okay? So let's not demonize the young men who are in gangs. Oh, they're sexually, assaulting girls. Yeah, and so are the kids in your fraternities. And the difference is that the white boys in the fraternities are not going to get arrested, okay? So always keep that in mind, but understand that these girls are in very dangerous situations, and beyond the risk of sexual assault and the good girl, bad girl stuff, and the partying involves heavier drug use. It involves the possibility that that party will be targeted by rival gangs, and we have seen those kinds of things recently all around the country. I think the gang problem is kicking back up because we've been so worried about the terrorism thing, and we've put all of our energy and our focus into, running around. So your poor kids on the campus who are Islamic are having to pass out information to me about Islam, which is very important. But meanwhile, we've taken all the money out of youth services in America. And, so the gang thing is kicking up again in my community, and I visit LA periodically, and I notice that it seems like it's kicking up again here. When no mystery. When you take your eye off the ball, it's a public health problem. It's going to start coming back. It's like you start treating your body badly, you get sick. You start treating the social, body that we all are badly, and sicknesses are going to show up. And that's what's going on here. Okay, why would girls set up other girls? As you kind of launch into the world of working with young women and girls, and all of my bright-eyed students say, oh, I can't wait to get out there with those young women. And by the way, a great shout out, I don't know if you read the Daily Bruin today. There's a young woman, her name is Pam Williams. She's in your College of Education, and she's running a program for girls, African-American girls in middle school here, and it's called 10 Girls. It's a wonderful mentoring program, it appears. We don't have good data on it. But it's, I'm so thrilled to see those kinds of initiatives happening. But while that's happening, if we're talking about the girls in the juvenile justice system, one of the things that's a little depressing is that these young women are not little feminists. They actually are very male identified. They're into excusing male violence and infidelity and blaming other young women if those guys step out on them. They think all other women are sluts and hoes. There's a very good study that documents this by Patricia Kelly, where she was a nurse in a detention center, and she ran focus groups with girls. So girls often police each other sexually. They can be kind of vicious to each other in those kinds of situations. So it's it's not surprising that they could get into wanting to please boys. And that might even involve setting up another young woman. One other, I'm sorry about all these dense ideas here. If you go and you talk to these young women about their lives, one of the reasons they're drawn to male violence is this weird thing that goes on. And here's how it works. If you've been terribly victimized, if you've grown up in a family that has a lot of physical violence, you might kind of sit there and go, what if I got as violent as I could possibly get? And you start thinking about kind of accessing male power through mimicking the male violence you're surrounded by. If you do that, and the studies are that girls who engage in a lot of aggression are really mimicking the male violence that they've seen, they will act out. But they will, if they acted out against the stepfather who was physically abusing them, I'd say right on. And sometimes they do. There's the ones that get arrested for domestic violence, by the way. But the other ones that fight with other girls over boys, and usually the boys are there in the audience watching, those young women are the ones you're going to be working with. And it's really challenging to get them to unpack some of these issues around this horizontal violence, as Freire called it, where oppressed groups attack each other. And young women are basically in that sort of frame. Okay, prevention and intervention implications then, knowing what we know. Expect trauma. Expect lots of victimization. Leslie Akoka's research on girls in the California juvenile justice system found the most victimizations among the girls in gangs. 6 different types of abuse. Expect PTSD that will have been labeled by the system as oppositional defiance disorder, something I've got a kind of ongoing chronic problem with authority, so I have that. I always worry when we start talking about kids who get in the face of adults and we talk about, you have oppositional defiance disorder. No, they're just pissed off at you because you're telling them stuff they don't want to listen to. And that's really important. So we got to prevent kids from being victimized. We've got to help them with their families. We've got to give them skills to avoid abusive and exploitive relationships, particularly with older men, because they target these young women who are so needy. And by older, I don't mean like they're 15 or they're 13 and their boyfriends are 15 or 18. I mean like they're 13 and he's 40. There's some creepy stuff here. Okay, what can we do? I always want to show Mary and Daniel's face. One thing we can do is understand that working smarter doesn't necessarily cost a dime more. What Mary and Daniel figured out when she was trying to get girls out of detention in Maryland was we could simply organize female-only caseloads and get people who wanted to work with girls to work with girls. And one of the other things Mary was, and she said, sometimes it's not about the money. It's just, and I think part of this is the culture of making do in African-American womanhood. You know, let's just do what we do smarter. The other thing that was brilliant about Mary was she knew that all the workers hated working with girls because girls are very needy and they're in your face about what they need. As opposed to boys who don't do anything till they kill somebody. You know, I was worried about why do we, and of course we excuse male violence all the time. So we're busy policing girls, being on their girls' cases. They're always back in the detention center. So Marion figured that out. And she understood that there was a need for advocacy. And the other thing that she did brilliantly was she built girls' allies. And she sought girl allies. She went out into the community and found prominent African-American groups and brought those women in to meet the girls that were in the juvenile justice system. That same thing has worked again and again. This is a best practice program. Movimiento, there are very few girls' programs that have been established as really excellent. And this one that was in Pueblo, Colorado, Movimiento Ascendencia, was one of those best practices. So we know what works with girls. It is good case management. It's that simple, really. It's a mix of helping them with the problems that are gendered that they have as well as the ones that aren't. It is advocating for them, and that's another thing that Marion did, was she advocated for the girls who were in detention. This is, again, mentioning FIT, her program. Our program, we started a thing called Girls Court. And OJJDP has just said that's a best practice. Now, I'm sensing, it's like a class, you know when it's over because people start leaving, so maybe I better wind you down here. But Hawaii Girls Court was the same thing. It's just working with the same resources. But we had a judge who got it, that girls, she had come out of drug court, so she understood that people had special needs, and she wanted to use the same resources, but use them smarter. So we have some great data now to suggest that when you get girls' expertise and when you get probation officers who really don't want to just bust kids, who actually want to work with kids and help kids, you get positive changes. And you get that runaway behavior that the young woman was so concerned about down. Because that's a coping strategy girls have. As soon as something gets tough or difficult or whatever, they just book. They're just out of there. Okay, and I haven't been able to talk about this, but I will just remind you what the backdrop is here. Girls are getting arrested in much larger numbers. What I haven't mentioned, and usually do in presentations, but I wanted to talk specifically about gang dynamics, so haven't had as much time to talk about it, is that self-fulfilling prophecy is happening. We are arresting more girls, and the justice system is holding on to them. And where are they holding them? Well, we've seen between 95 and 05, a 48.6% increase in girls' detentions during a time we have only seen a 7.3% increase in the detention of boys. And an earlier data point was that we had seen an 88% increase in girls' commitments to training schools. So even though the girls' behavior has not gotten more serious, we have many more girls in detention and many more girls in training schools than we had a couple of decades ago. I have to tell you, this is a real scary development, because for decades we've been talking about deinstitutionalizing state offenders, and we had large numbers of girls leaving those settings. And now we're seeing just the reverse occurring. So we do have a worry about incarceration. I mean, the juvenile justice system is not seen, and certainly in California you've noticed this, the juvenile justice system is not seeing massive incarceration of kids. In fact, you're talking about dismantling your CYA. I mean, that's unbelievable. It's a great opportunity. But with these pressures, that's going to be harder. And with this political environment where everybody wants to just snap out and be mean to everybody, it's a miracle that it hasn't gotten much worse. But nationally, I want to let you know the incarceration of kids, and incarceration in unbelievably bad conditions. I've just been looking at the gendered punishment regimes in our detention center, and they're medieval. And we have had scandals. That's another reason why we're getting kids out of facilities, is we don't do a good job when we put kids in facilities. And those judges who are talking about putting these girls in detention because they're concerned about protecting them need to check out who's running their detention centers. Because we have Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International looking into the conditions of our facilities. They're so bad for kids. Yeah?
Could you speak a little bit to the role of privatization of prisons, both in the increase in arrests and also in terms of the treatment of youth prisoners?
Very important, very important. I'll speak about one particular case in Pennsylvania which really nutshells this. They actually literally arrested 2 juvenile court judges who had a financial stake in a detention center nearby, and the detention center, the private for-profit detention center, was not getting enough referrals, and so suddenly a group of young kids came in for the kinds of things. I think one young woman had said something bad about her principal on a Facebook page, and she went to the detention center. So, and then they eventually, thank heavens, there's still some journalism left in America, and basically this was uncovered by enterprising reporters who figured out these judges had a financial stake in those facilities. That's a pretty direct example, but there are many. I mean, once you get into mass incarceration, which is where we've gone as a society, and when you mix in a financial incentive into the bargain, it gets very frightening because people are literally making money if people stay locked up. So very, very important question. If we fail to protect girls from abuse in the families, if we let them solve their problems themselves by going out onto the streets, and if their neighborhood has gangs there, they go there, we end up putting them in tremendous jeopardy to get into a system that will not do well by them. So I think I will end with that, and just thank you all very much. Mahalo for your hospitality, and if you have questions or Georgia wants to...
I was going to say, I really think we have time. Some people are on to class at 1.
Okay.
They're scheduled to go until 2. So I think it's a good time for people to kind of throw some topics out there
Good.
that you can comment on. At length, don't feel there's time.
I have more PowerPoints. Yeah. Go ahead. Comments, questions, ideas?
Do you want me to... Oh, go ahead.
Okay.
I saw a very interesting program on television a few months ago, and portrayed 2 sisters who were both in gangs. The father was in a gang, the brothers were in gangs. It was a very gang-oriented household.
Oh, right. Family members in gangs is huge. Yeah.
And the father was very violent, and he really approved of what the daughters were doing. He was encouraging them. And one of the sisters was kind of really got pregnant, and she was kind of wanting to get out of there. The other sister was almost suicidal, and then she was like going out and pulling out gang members in the opposite gang, saying, "I'm here, come and fight me."
Yeah.
And that was the one she was like determined, really in a real bad shape. And then somebody looked at her and got her to write poetry or something, or maybe she was incarcerated, but she had to write poetry. And she just totally softened up and began crying and all this. And I was wondering, what kinds of programs have been most fun to work with Rosemary to help them shed this image of temperance?
Well, I'm haunted by, when I last saw John Hagedorn in Chicago, he was telling me of a young woman, very much like the one you just described, who is up now for capital punishment because she basically got in one of those suicidal places in her head and got into a basically very confused melee. Her stepfather had been abusing her since she was 6. He was involved in the gang she was in. It was very convoluted, but somehow in all of that mix, a kid died, and she was among the people present when the death occurred. And as you now know, the law involves everybody who's in a situation like that, not just the person with the weapon. And she is in very serious trouble. One of the things that happens when girls get into those situations where it's a drive-by and they're in the car and a shot is fired, people, no girl thinks that she's going to be getting tried for murder, but she will be tried for murder. And then she very loyally, stand by your man, so she's not going to rat out her boys. And of course they rat her out right away. And there's another very good video talking about girls in gangs. I don't like the title of it. It's called, it's one of those gangster girls. I think that literally is the title of it. But they have a number of interviews with young women doing very, very long stretches in prison, sometimes in adult prison because they were tried as adults, for murders that happened when they were teenagers. And these young women they will never have children unless they have children by a guard, because they will be in prison for decades because of those situations. So what works is kind of pitifully simple, but let me read you a bit about Movimiento Hacienda, because that program, is really, it touches a lot of the right bases, and I brought that along because I anticipated people were going to be interested in that program. Where'd it go? There we are. Okay, so it was established in Pueblo, Colorado to provide girls with positive alternatives to substance abuse and gang involvement. Outreach workers, so it does have an outreach component, to 8 to 19-year-old girls. Some girls were referred to it. Staffed with workers, now this was interesting to me, staffed with workers who were trained in conflict resolution. Now that's very important because, these gangs are constantly in mini wars with each other. So you have to really understand the terrain you're on in terms of these very explosive situations. There's a very good book, by the way, that my friend Karen Omimoto did about the gang war in Venice called The Truce, where she documents some of these convoluted dynamics between African American and Latino gang members right here in this area. So very important to know that you're in a very dangerous, potentially, environment, because everyone in America is armed to the teeth, for God's sake, we've normalized that. It's so weird if you go to Canada and to Australia, by the way. They think we're mad. They think we're clinically mad. And I'm hard, and of course they're looking at me like, I'm getting tired of this. Maybe your generation can undo some of this stuff. Okay, trained conflict mediation, signs and symptoms of drug and alcohol abuse. There are mixed data, but some data suggests that girls are closing the gap on boys with drug use. So girls are self-medicating for that trauma that they have, and they have a lot of mental health issues. So one of the problems is if you get them into a 12-step program, if they stop using drugs, now you've got another problem. Because now you have mental illness, because our trauma, post-PTSD basically. So that has to be part of you have to anticipate that that's going to happen. You have to expect that the girls, especially if you've got court-involved girls, you have trauma. You will have PTSD. Get someone in your mix now who can help with the mental health stuff. Because I always go out with these naive social worker crowd, and they're like, oh, God, we can all get together, we're going to love each other. And they've got girls who, and these girls have access to drugs because why? They're selling drugs, but there's another thing going on here that the boys don't have. The 40-year-old boyfriends, remember them? Okay, what are they giving girls? Drugs. When we look at the girls who are in the facilities, they are much more likely to have more drug involvement because of these involvements in mixed-sex groups with older males who have given them drugs. Now, we will talk about the sexual victimization and survival sex that the girls have now then engaged in to get the drugs and to continue getting the drugs, and that's what the young men know. So this, again, is the way the gender works in this terrain. Yes, you've got the gang piece, but you've also got the gender piece, and you've got the racism piece. And so all of those have to be, kind of in your brain. So Okay, you're providing information on sexually transmitted diseases. Check out the STD rates in your local detention centers. Not good news. Not good news. Dangerous ones and undiagnosed often. So that's important. Cultural awareness, mediation, and self-esteem and social support program components. Mentoring, sports, huge. I always talk about, when reporters call me, they're like, you know, they want to talk to me about bad news about girls. And I say, why don't you guys ever cover the good news about girls? They're like, what good news? I said, sports. Heard about that? Heard about Title IX, anybody? It's incredible. And shout out to Patsy Takemoto-Mink from my state, who pushed through that legislation in the 70s because as a young woman of color in the United States, she knew that she could not get into medical school and only got into law school because the people didn't know she was female, and thought that Hawaii was a foreign country. So she got to be an international student. That was the only way she got into law school. She was Japanese American, grew up on Maui. But Patsy pushes through Title IX in 1972 with the help of brave women in the House and Senate who pushed and pushed and pushed on this, and they didn't want to give athletics an exemption, and thank God they didn't. Because now, when Patsy was trying to go to law school, 3% of law schools were female. When people like Ruth Bader Ginsburg went through law school, it was 3% female. It's now 50% female. You know, 50% of business enrollments, female. 50% of medical school enrollments, female. These are tremendous victories, but what I see in my classroom are the young women who've been involved in sports and continue to be involved in sports and are going to school on athletic scholarships. So good for Pueblo, Colorado for recognizing sports isn't going to work for everybody, and you got to watch for coaching abuse. You got to make sure, you know, sports doesn't even work for all boys. In America, all we think delinquency prevention is boys playing sports. And every time I see the, football tryouts and cheerleader tryouts at Palama Settlement, I know there's still a reason for me to be teaching women's studies, We do not want girls watching boys play sports. We want girls playing sports. And, working on that, the body image issues around that. Okay, tutoring and homework support, gender-specific life skills training, focusing on, again, self-esteem, pregnancy prevention, self-defense, and career goals. A lot of focus on culture, and most importantly, a safe haven. What if she can't go home? I was in Connecticut once, and there was a social worker sitting in the room very frustrated, and she said, I have a young girl that I'm working with who is sleeping in our broom closet because she can't go home. That's what's going on. So this is, and there was somebody I was introduced to earlier who was talking about girls or people aging out of the foster care system. Oh my God, 18. Think of yourself at 18, and then imagine that you have a little daughter, and then imagine that you're going to be thrown out of the only home you've ever known at 18 because there's no place for you anymore. You're aged out. And I remember this young African-American girl on this panel just crying, saying, please help me. I don't know what I'm going to do tomorrow. When they throw me out in a month, I don't know what I'm going to do. And everyone said, we just, oh God. So I'm, shout out to the people doing foster care transition planning, and, needs to be a lot better, but yes, ma'am.
So I'm sure there's a lot of these female gang members having children. And so how is the interaction once, and as far as having children in the gang, and I'm sure there's a DCFS involvement with that, the Department of Children and Family Services.
It's complicated. In some ways, having children causes girls to age out of gangs. In other words, that transition to motherhood wakes them up, and it's like, oh, maybe, like the other young woman that you were showcasing who was like, maybe I don't want to be in this environment. So one reason we think girls leave earlier is motherhood. They don't leave to great alternatives. And sometimes they'll come back around. I'm thinking about a great ethnography that was done about the Potrero Hill girls in San Francisco. And the Potrero Hill girls, they were an African-American gang that boosted. They would take orders from the housing project, and then they would go down to Neiman Marcus and shoplift in San Francisco and take it back. And they didn't wear any gang attire at all, and they had no faith in men whatsoever. They'd given up on men, and they were just supporting themselves. But none of them wanted and they would use their children to help with the boosting. So they would take strollers and shoplift. But none of them wanted their kids in gangs. They were surviving economically through drug sales and shoplifting. And so it's also racialized. Latinas are more hopeful about men than are African American girls who are involved in gangs. African American girls have just pretty much had it with men already, and that makes them more susceptible to the economic gang elements. So, but motherhood does complicate things, and it doesn't automatically mean that they will raise their children in the gang. And in fact, can have a more complicated, meaning. But that's pretty much it. And pregnancy, oh God, you know what the terrain is we're on now, in terms of choices and those kinds of things. That's a tough one too. And workers have to work with girls where they are and where they want to be. And I see your answer, so I'm going to get to you in a second. But that's another thing that's tough about working with girls. Number one, there's not a lot of good services for girls. And that gets frustrating. If you're a worker that really cares about your girls, and you go, okay, reproductive health services for low-income girls in America. Not so much. What about if they, often they'll make a choice that you wouldn't necessarily make at their age, and how do you deal with that? That produces stress. When we interview people who work with girls, that's a toughie, because you want to be where they are, and often they're like, I want to have the baby. Madonna had a baby, what's that? Angelina Jolie has a baby. Yeah, she's richer than God, okay? And of course she had the baby. She's got Brad Pitt carrying babies, for God's sake. But, that's another thing. A lot of girls buy into this sort of motherhood mystique, that this is going to be somebody who's going to love me. And then it's like, oh my God, this is someone who's screaming and yelling and wrecking my life. So then you get the CPS involvement and those kinds of things. Or maybe she goes back with that abusive boyfriend because now she's got a kid and she needs some help. Nikki Jones's other book that she wrote before working on the book that we did together is called Between Good and Ghetto. And she interviews a group of young African American girls in Philly who are negotiating those kinds of transitions, both trying to go to school, trying to have kids, trying to get a good life for themselves in a hyper-violent neighborhood in Philadelphia. So you've been so patient, my friend, and you had a question. So
yeah, this may be broad, but I think it's important. I was interested in your description of how misogynistic approaches were responding to the growing problem of girls in gangs. What do you think may be part of the role of misogyny in the formation of girls of this problem? And I know in a way I feel like everything you said that was the undertone, right? Like
sure. Brilliant.
I wonder what we can say about it in a slightly more specific manner.
Beautiful. Well, if we want to prevent most violent crime in America, we should be doing gender-responsive programming with which sex? Boys and men. Because they commit, and there's a great resource for just your regular classes in all the work done by the Media Education Foundation. I would call, even though it's a little bit dated now, specific focus to Jackson Katz's wonderful Tough Guys, which is tough, G-U-I-S-E, talking about the front that all men are expected to have, that tough front, that violent front. Right. So I hope you see. So masculinities talks about, first, hegemonic masculinity, which I get just bombarded with every time I go through O'Hare. It's like, my friend Joe Belknap used to call O'Hare planet of the men. It's the men. And it's hegemonic masculinity to the max. And that's white male, Martin Sheen had a $173,000 watch. Charlie Sheen, yeah, I'm sorry, it's showing my age here. That's his dad. Christ, Charlie Sheen, the violent tornado of screwed upness, yeah. And I was thinking, $175,000 watch. And it was how he got in that fight with the hooker. He contends. Now, who knows what's going on in that brain? See, I could talk for days. You're going to pull me off the stage. But back to the masculinity stuff. You have hegemonic masculinity, which is that white power, first class, united, mileage plus guy. It's just awful. If you ever do get upgraded to first class, they're just awful. So you almost don't want to be in first class, because it's like you just have to What do you do? Oh, really? Let's see, let me get out my little headphones. Okay, I fly enough because I live in Hawaii, so, you know, I get into these settings. So the first we have to understand is the masculinity of power. And I always do with my students, I talk about, I'm a sociologist by training, so I talk about ascribed and achieved roles, and I talk about what are the, if you wanted to be born, what gender do you want to be born? And of course, everyone says male, and then what ethnicity, and then we drill down, and we don't just say, you don't just want to be born white. What do you want to be born? Do we have chalk here? No. Jewish? No, man, no. Still, anti-Semitism rocks in America, you know. No, we really still have anti-Semitic people. I can't believe it, you know. It's like, isn't that like old-fashioned? What happened, you know? Gentleman's agreement, and did you miss that decade where we felt bad about the Holocaust? Apparently they did. That was, what's that guy? They just got rid of him. Glenn Beck, yeah. A great loss. Great loss. Okay, back to hegemonic masculinity. What better example of it than this babbling fool white guy? And of course, my point always is when I talk to my students about male privilege is you can pick a guy who's, you know, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, born rich, and actually you can find several examples of this in our political landscape, but let's just talk about, and dumb as a piece of toast, and he was President of the United States. He bragged about the C's he got at Yale. So the enormous privilege that boys get, and especially boys, and despite his construction of himself as a cowboy, he was really an East Coast elite, white male. Okay, so now we have Latinos negotiating this terrain, getting exposed to a youth culture which valorizes physical violence and toughness, exposed to prison gangs, and I'm telling you what you know about why do we wear loose pants, because that's what you get in prison. That way in which you do masculinity, and of course you're negotiating terrain that is very dangerous for you physically. You may be engaged in economic activities that are extremely dangerous for you. So you cultivate a kind of violent hyper-masculinity and toughness to be in that space, and it destroys you. It destroys you. When I first started teaching in prison or working in prison, the young men that I was working with, all Hawaiian, because of course in Hawaii we don't have enough Latinos and blacks to lock up, so we lock up Native Hawaiians. And we do in big numbers. And they were doing a presentation called Big Boys Don't Cry. So in prison they were having this conversation with themselves about their violent childhoods and their own violence. And prison gives you a chance. That was the one thing the Quakers got right about the penitentiary. It does give you a chance to think on what you've done. And they did. And they talked about their lives in ways that were just remarkable in the presentation that I saw. And that was the first time I ever went to prison, and it was a delinquency prevention program that didn't work, but was fascinating. It was an attempt at Scared Straight, which actually, if you ever saw the people who really did Scared Straight, they talked way more about their own histories. And it's not a good idea to expose kids to that, but it was very interesting. So I began to wonder a lot about masculinity, and one of the young men that I was, now he's not so young, but that I was exposed to was a guy who was in prison for murder. A lot of them went for murder. And he told me about a childhood that he had where he woke up from one of the beatings that he'd been the victim of in his own blood in a bathtub. That's what he remembered, was waking up having been so badly beaten by his father that he was bleeding so much he was in a bathtub. So he later is in a drug fog, basically in a high-speed chase, kills somebody, and was in prison for murder. And was so, but that kind of hyper-masculinity is something that really, so when you do work with gang kids, I think talking about masculinity and reflecting on and trying to teach boys this thing called empathy that girls learn. The reason it's easier to work with girls who are violent is that they feel bad about it almost right afterwards. And they immediately feel remorse and want to talk to the people that they hurt. And this is why even when they try to find these really hyper-violent, evil, bad girls, they usually find girls that are much more reflective and Because again, we've been raised as young women. And so mostly it's about empathy and relationships. And when you work with girls, you need to work with those relationships, as complicated as they are. And as my student Scott Okamoto observed, group homes tend to be designed around this notion of there are 8 boys being on a team and you've got 1 coach. With girls, you need much smaller groups. And you need to be very aware of the dynamics and the clique dynamics in girls' groups, so that we don't have girls getting picked on by other girls. And remember that girl that I talked about, she doesn't like other girls necessarily. So you're going to have to work on those issues, the self-hatred, the misogyny, that she's very boy-identified and wants to please boys and men, and who doesn't? I mean, they have all the power, and her friends don't. So those are, but yeah, and anybody got any good masculinity interventions, let me know. Because I got a campus that I got to go back to that needs some of that all the time. We have terminal, too many men in power problems. Okay, other thoughts, questions? Yeah.
How do girls enter gangs? Is there a gender difference between how girls and boys?
Oh, well, I think all of the data here, I mean, there's some very bad stories of girls entering gangs, and basically they're gang rapes. And that's back to, I was talking about those gender dynamics in gangs. Girls who are jumped in typically have way more prestige because they've gone in through the male door as opposed to basically being set up as a sort of victim of sexual assault. But I don't want to overemphasize that because the data on how frequently that happens or whether that's a routine thing, I think can be overstated because it's so sensationalistic. I think girls actually join just like they join the Girl Scouts. They're vulnerable, and that was John's point. I mean, he found that girls were getting initiated, but they could also just drift in and they could drift out. And it was a lot less of the drama. Some of these initiations, we caught local reporters in Honolulu trying to set up these gang initiations so that they could film it for the local TV news. So I think one of the things we have to be really careful of is looking at the data in complicated ways and not necessarily saying a girl this always happens, this is always how she has to get beat out. Maybe she doesn't have to get beat out. And I think there's just a lot more kids around. I think these groups are more porous than we imagine. And girls especially can move between groups, and that both endangers them but also empowers them because they've still got their sexual capital. They're 13, 14, 15 years old in a culture that venerates youthful beauty. So I would say the data suggests that, like boys, there's lots of ways in and out, but there can be danger, and for girls, the danger can be very bad if you're the victim of a gang rape, and that can happen. Like in a fraternity, we get a girl drunk, and those parties are also situations of great danger for the girls because there's a lot of alcohol and a lot of drugs, and that means gang rape. Yeah. You? Again? Yes, talk. Or somebody else talk.
I have one.
Good. Then we'll you and you. Yes, go ahead.
One thing I was curious about, you often hear about the role of the absent father and how that creates men who grow up with lack of violence regulation, emotional regulation, is lack of role models. But now what I'm wondering about is, now that there's more and more sort of mothers missing from family structure, that has a corollary role. And also, what is the role that I mean, I haven't heard about it very much, but maybe it's my limited exposure or education to this, but what is the role of the missing father in young women's lives as they enter this kind of career?
You're asking good questions.
Is it analogous, or how analogous is it?
Well, there's missing father in the abstract, and then there's the actual dad that was missing in your life. And it may be good news that he's not around. It certainly wasn't. I mean, why am I empathetic to, I have to decide how much of this to talk about. It's not always good news to have dad around. So that's the first thing. In general, is it good to grow up without a father? Yeah, if he beat you up, then it's good he's gone. But is it good in general? When I went through college, I lied all the time until one of my advisors figured out I was just lying. You know, I was just talking about my parents, and she said, you know, your father isn't in your life, is he? And she busted me. It was like, he was papered over. You know, yeah, you want dad? Here's dad, you know. Vaguely referred to always. So, yes, in general, if we imagine that sort of little house on the prairie family, it's good to have both parents present. And then we can think sociologically, what happens when dad leaves? And certainly economically, the family is hugely challenged because we pay, especially African American and Latino women, far less than we pay their white counterparts. And so they're earning 50 to 60%, whereas I get to earn a whole 75% of what my male white counterparts earn. But Latinas and African Americans, so the economic consequence. And that's what happens. These girls that, like Nikki was interviewing, they were going in and out of these relationships with abusive boys and men, partly because they wanted the men involved in their child's life, partly because they needed the money that the men represented. But I urge you to read Between Good and Ghetto, because it really presents a complicated picture of what does that really mean? Is it, you know, this guy is dealing drugs, this guy is abusive in one case. In another case, he was not abusive, he was just dealing drugs. But what does dealing drugs mean? This is America. We have a war on drugs. It means if she's living in the house with him, when he gets busted, she gets busted for dealing drugs. And she's living with him because he has money to help her support her kid. So I think you can look at that sort of 10,000-foot level and say, it's very bad to have kids with no family. And we can see that because mass incarceration has now swept up so many women. It's not just, we ran out of men to arrest. We arrested almost, you know, what percentage of the African-American male population, and we still wanted to build more prisons. So now are arresting huge numbers of African-American women. So now their children are being raised by grandparents. And that's the pattern. We are also arresting large numbers of Latinas, and so their children are now being raised by grandparents. Men usually disappear when women go to prison. So it's not like then fathers raise children. It's like, no, then somebody in the family, usually her mother, picks up those responsibilities. So yeah, in the perfect world, it would be great to have everybody present, but what happens when people are absent? Yeah, it's the males in those situations were unlikely to provide the kind of male mentorship that you're describing in the main. What does that mean programmatically, though? It does mean we have to really self-consciously think about how do you do masculinity in nonviolent ways, and how do you get boys and men to understand that you are self-consciously doing this. That there are ways to do masculinity that don't involve use of violence and threats. And you model that and you talk about it with the boys, because dad won't be able to. And maybe mom won't be able to either, because maybe she's never seen it. So I'm all for, you know, people say, what about the boys? I say, right, what about the boys? What have you done lately for boys besides put them on football teams, or in my state it was boxing. I got in a huge thing about the boxing program in Waipaki, total gang neighborhood. And I understand some about diet and discipline, but you know, you're hitting somebody. Can we think of something else? How about a chess club? I don't know, you know, tennis, you know, I don't. Mix it up. The other thing is, do gender with your kids. They love popular culture. The girls love to talk about weight issues and beauty issues and the beauty ideal and how racist that is. With boys, they love pop culture too. And they're very visual. So use the interest they have in popular culture to unpack, what is this urban street youth thing? What's going on with that? And get them to talk to you about it. You know, just an idea. I do that, that's all I do in my classes is talk about gender. And people love it. And I'm a frustrated stand-up comic, so use a lot of humor, because this is grim stuff, but there's a lot of fun stuff that you can do around the gender. And Tough Guys is actually as weighty as it is. That's a good one. Another good resource if you're working with kids is a video called Spin the Bottle, which talks about alcohol use and gender. Gene Kilbourne's in it, Jackson Katz in it, 30 minutes. It's just action-packed and very good. And it talks about how the alcohol industry markets to boys using masculinity and their insecurity about that they're not male enough, and it shows, you know, guys getting a Budweiser and the two beautiful girls, not one but two. And he's an ordinary looking guy, and the girls are being told, you know, you don't feel sexual, you don't feel attractive. How about if you had a couple of glasses of beer, or maybe a shot or two? Then your girl's gone wild. So the whole MTV, and get them to unpack the popular culture around adolescence, and especially in drug use. My boss is here, and she's signaling that we're done.
So, signal. I want to thank Meda so much.